Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I'm sure we all wish Kevin and Juliet the best. Yeah, so before, I found the talks fascinating. Actually, I guess I should say that I don't see my Wittgenstein in any of the presentations that were offered here today. And that could be because my Wittgenstein is just a figment of my imagination. We'll see about that. The text for the following sermon is Strouds' great 1965 paper, which has been alluded to already. And I was originally quite worried about that because I thought that the paper would be too narrow for most listeners. But in fact, it seems to me the long shadow of that paper is visible on everything that's been said so far today. So perhaps it'll be of some interest after all. I guess the last thing I'll say before starting is that this paper is not scholarly at all, at least in the sense that I am not concerned with anything except for Wittgenstein's remarks in the investigations. I think that that holds a very particular place, and I'm trying to make sense of his thought there. Okay, so let me start. Ludwig Wittgenstein, summarizing his philosophical method, famously and puzzlingly wrote, this is one on your handout, "What we are supplying are really remarks on the natural history of man. Not curiosities, however, but rather observations on facts which no one has doubted and which have only gone unremarked because they are always before our eyes." This claim is puzzling. Quote, "Remarks on the natural history of man" sound like empirical remarks, not like the upshot of the linguistic investigations, as he puts it, into the grammar of our locutions that dominate Wittgenstein's later philosophy. What does Wittgenstein think is the relation between these remarks and his investigations? The central aim of this paper is to answer the question, and in so doing provide a satisfactory interpretation of what Wittgenstein means by the natural history of man. We shall first, I keep saying we because I have co-written this paper with Nishi Shah, also at Amherst College. We shall first present our understanding of Barry Strouds' reading of these remarks in his classic paper, Wittgenstein and Logical Necessity. We shall then argue that this reading does not sit comfortably with other remarks that Wittgenstein offers on his method and his conception of philosophy. And finally, we shall provide an interpretation that takes more seriously than Stroud does that the point of almost all of Wittgenstein's remarks is to forestall and dispel philosophical confusions by highlighting the grammar of our words and not, as Stroud would have it, to announce marvelous discoveries, for example, about the nature of humans. Stroud finds that Wittgenstein has two different kinds of contingent fact in mind in his remarks on the natural history of man. Consider, for example, the activity of calculating. Stroud writes, this is number 2 on your handout, "There are various facts which make it possible for calculating to occur at all. For example, our memories are generally good enough for us not to take numbers twice in counting up to 12 and not to leave any out. In correlating two groups of 5 strokes, we practically always can do so without remainder. Somebody who has learned to calculate never goes on getting different results in a given multiplication from what is in the arithmetic books, and so on." Stroud says, "The inhabitants of the earth might have lacked these and other simple abilities, and if so, there would be no such thing as calculating at all. In that way, the possibility of calculating depends on such contingent facts. Thus, I take it, Stroud says, there are contingent facts, such as possession of certain simple abilities, that are, so it seems, metaphysical requirements for any kind of calculation. Without them, it would not be possible for an inhabitant of the earth to engage in any form of calculation at all. The second kind of contingency that Stroud discerns comes into view if we consider Wittgenstein's famous example of the wayward pupil. That is someone who, when given the order add 2, writes down the same numerals as we do up to 1,000, but then goes on 1,004, 1,008. We are asked to imagine that this divergence is not due to, quote, simple misunderstanding, stupidity, or deliberate perversity on the part of the pupil, unquote. I was quoting Stroud. Wittgenstein describes the pupil as follows. It's not on your handouts, it's a very famous quotation, so I didn't put it down. He describes the pupil as follows, quote, in such a case, we might say, perhaps, it comes natural to this person to understand our order with our explanations as we should understand the order add 2 up to 1,000, 4 up to 2,000, 6 up to 3,000, and so on. Wittgenstein goes on. Such a case would present similarities with one in which a person naturally reacted to the gesture of pointing with the hand by looking in the direction of the line from fingertip to wrist and not from wrist to fingertip. Unquote. Stroud interprets Wittgenstein here to mean that our natural sensibilities, for example, our judgment that this is the same way of going on as that, are, quote, responsible for, Stroud's words, unquote, our adding as we do, while the pupil's very different reactions, quote, determine, unquote, his adding as he does. Stroud writes, this is 3 on your handout, Wittgenstein gives many examples of people whose ways of inferring, counting, calculating, and so forth are different in significant ways from ours, unquote. For Stroud, it is a contingent fact that we have the natural sensibilities that we do, sensibilities that are responsible for our engaging in our particular species of calculation. But there are other species of calculation as well, he holds, ones that are metaphysically underwritten by different sensibilities, which humans do not have, but which other possible creatures might. That's Stroud's view. Stroud sums up the view he attributes to Wittgenstein by saying that, this is 4 on your handout, it's a contingent fact that calculating, inferring, and so forth are carried out in the ways that they are, just as it is a contingent fact that there is such a thing as calculating, inferring at all, unquote. As we understand Stroud, this view is the consequence of 2 thoughts he finds in Wittgenstein. First, that it is a contingent fact that some creatures have the sensibilities humans possess. And second, that such sensibilities are metaphysical conditions for the pursuit of certain activities. This second claim is what we take him to be articulating when he depicts Wittgenstein as uncovering the conditions that certain activities depend on, those conditions that are responsible for their pursuit. In reflecting on his imagined cases, Wittgenstein is, as it were, the armchair counterpart of the scientist who discovers preconditions for mammalian life on Earth, and perhaps even of any terrestrial life at all. Just adding a parenthesis, I hope that you will hear here many echoes of Bill's thought that it seems to be a substantive question, a substantive inquiry. What is required for the doing of mathematics? As he put it in his paper, what it is in virtue of which we are doing mathematics. The scientist's discoveries underwrite counterfactuals. For instance, that if there had been no water on Earth, then there would be no life on Earth. Or that if there had been water, but the atmosphere had been different in such and such ways, then different forms of life would have developed. Likewise, Stroud takes Wittgenstein's discoveries to license counterfactuals as well. For instance, that if people had different sensibilities from those they actually do, for example, that they take this to be the same way of going on as that, then they would be counting or calculating in different ways. But the news does not end there. For while we can say that if our sensibilities of sameness had been different, we would be counting in a different way, we cannot, according to Stroud, actually say or think what that different form of counting would be. The different form of counting would be intelligible to us only if we had different sensibilities, which we don't. Hence, we can at best see those different forms of counting out of the corner of our eye, as it were. We cannot fully grasp them head on. Stroud summarizes this upshot of Wittgenstein's investigation as follows. This is 5 in your handout. But we can understand and acknowledge the contingency of this fact, that we have the sensibilities that we do, and hence the possibility of different ways of calculating and so forth, without understanding what those different ways might have been, unquote. It cannot but excite a philosopher to learn that not only are there variants of familiar cognitive activities, ones we could have engaged in had our sensibilities been different, but that these variants are perforce not fully intelligible to us. Stroud's view that Wittgenstein is the bearer of such dizzying news should give one pause. After all, Wittgenstein regularly and emphatically insists that his method in philosophy does not result in news, let alone marvelous news. He writes, quote, "It is rather of the essence of our investigation that we do not seek to learn anything new by it. We want to understand something that is already in plain view," he says. "For this is what we seem in some sense not to understand," unquote. Philosophy for Wittgenstein does not have a distinctive subject matter about which discoveries can be made, a fortiori not discoveries that make one's head spin. Furthermore, Wittgenstein does not take himself to be offering explanations, much less metaphysical ones, for our linguistic activities. He writes, this is 6 on your handout, "Our mistake is to look for an explanation where we ought to look at what happens as a proto-phenomenon. That is, where we ought to have said, this language game is played." Unquote. Sorry, not unquote. The question is not one of explaining a language game by means of our experiences, something I feel was, but of noting a language game. But Stroud's talk of our sensibilities being responsible for our capacity to engage in certain activities, or of the latter depending on the former, strongly suggests precisely the mistake that Wittgenstein warns against. That Stroud has taken a wrong turn in his reading of Wittgenstein is further revealed by some of the very quotations to which Stroud himself draws our attention. Thus he quotes Wittgenstein's remark, 7 on your handout, "The steps which are not brought in question are logical inferences. But the reason why they are not brought in question is not that they certainly correspond to the truth or something of the sort. No. It's just this that is called thinking, speaking, inferring, arguing." A straightforward reading of this leads to the conclusion that the wayward pupil is not, as Stroud would have it, engaged in a variant of adding. Rather, whatever he is up to, it's not adding, not what is called adding. Thus, the wayward pupil does not count as a marvel, someone who engages in a new form of adding that we can only dimly comprehend. Stroud seems to recognize that our reading of this quotation is the most straightforward one. He writes, 8 on your handout, "These remarks suggest that the source of necessity in inferring or calculating is simply that any activity in which just any results were allowed would not be called inferring, calculating, and so forth," unquote. Furthermore, I think he recognizes that so understood, Wittgenstein is voicing the most natural response to examples like that of the wayward pupil. But Stroud thinks that, natural as this response may be, it's mistaken, and that consequently we should not interpret Wittgenstein as offering it. Why does Stroud think this natural response is incorrect? Stroud glosses the natural response, for instance, that what the wayward pupil does is not what we call adding, as the claim that the pupil means something different by add to from what we do, and thus that the pupil has, quote, adopted different conventions, as Stroud puts it, regarding his words. And Stroud believes this cannot be correct. 9, your handout. Stroud says, one thing implied by saying that we have adopted or are following a convention is that there are alternatives which we could adopt in its place, unquote. And this is false in the examples under consideration, he says. Quote, but in the case of writing 1002 right after 1000, there appear to be no alternatives open to us, unquote. Stroud believes that our natural sensibilities simply block our adoption of any alternative conventions. Once we realize this, he holds, we must acknowledge that we have not adopted a convention with respect to our words after all, and consequently that the natural response is incorrect. We believe that the movement of Stroud's thought here is a fine example of how, in philosophy, as Wittgenstein sees it, the road to a perilous ambition is paved by innocent steps. As we saw, Stroud considers a natural response to the kinds of examples he discusses, for example, the wayward pupil, namely that we do not want to call what he is doing adding. So far, so good. He then goes on to gloss this response in a particular way. The natural response, he says, is in effect that while we have adopted a certain convention governing the word add, the pupil has adopted a different one. Is there anything illegitimate with this gloss? Staring at the words, there's no way to answer this question. It all depends on how one moves on from them. This may surprise those readers of Wittgenstein who interpret him as an advocate of linguistic policing. The problem with philosophers on this interpretation of Wittgenstein is that they misuse language in some way. But there need be nothing problematic with the locution, adopted different conventions. It could, for example, be an innocent shorthand for the natural response. Wittgenstein's point is rather that this locution already has a role in the language, and so it is particularly easy for a philosopher to lose sight of the fact that it had been innocently adopted here as a shorthand for the natural response. Once its origins are obscured, a philosopher begins to see the locution differently. In particular, sees it as it figures in substantive claims elsewhere in the language. The philosopher thus comes to take the natural response to involve a substantive claim, in this case, that speakers have, in some independently understood sense, adopted different conventions. This claim might even be taken ambitiously, as what ultimately justifies our natural response, that this is not to be called an instance of that. What was initially an innocent shorthand for a response becomes the dog that wags the tail of that reaction. In sum, we find unconvincing Stroud's reason for rejecting the natural response to Wittgenstein's imagined cases. And I take it that Annalisa was actually voicing that natural response in the question that she asked here about the log counters, whether we would indeed call this counting out the logs. Okay, but are there reasons to reject Stroud's own response to these cases? In fact, we think Wittgenstein himself supplies such reasons. Section 2. Recall that in response to the suggestion that there are other forms of logical inference, albeit mistaken ones, Wittgenstein says, no, it's just this that we call thinking, speaking, inferring, and arguing. We have dubbed this the natural response. Stroud's reaction is very different. If we encountered people who claim to engage in a different kind of logical inference, he would hold that they may very well be engaged in an activity of inferring of a different kind, perhaps of a kind that we, given our sensibilities and ways of going on, cannot fully understand. What are Wittgenstein's reasons for rejecting a reaction like Strouds? Let us consider how Stroud would respond to someone who claims that people are in general agreement about color judgments. Stroud's reaction would be to take the remark as an anthropological one that is part of a larger anthropological observation, say about what our grasp of the concept of color depends on. On a Stroudian construal, we have an independent conception of what it is to have a color concept, and of what it is for there to be general agreement in color judgments, and then what we uncover by way of observation or reflection is that the latter is a necessary condition for the former. So understood, the remark that, quote, people are in general agreement about color judgments, unquote, reports a substantive requirement for some fact about humans to obtain. Just as life on Earth requires the presence of water, so here we are being informed that the possession of color concepts depends on there being similarities of responses within a community. The connection between the condition and what it is a condition for may be empirical in nature or something stronger. Regardless, the condition itself is taken to be substantive in that it's a contingent matter whether it holds or not. Thus, a hallmark of an anthropological construal is that we take ourselves to understand what it would be for the relevant condition to fail to hold. The above observation, anthropologically understood, takes it to be a contingent fact that a community agrees in its color judgments. That is, that such agreements may fail to obtain. But this anthropological understanding is one that Wittgenstein is in fact determined to show up as illusory. Consider what Wittgenstein has to say in Philosophical Investigations about this issue of color judgments. This is 10 on your handout. Does it make sense to say that people generally agree in their judgments of color? What would it be for them not to? One man would say a flower was red, which another called blue, and so on. The interlocutor says that. And Wittgenstein says, but what right should we have to call these people's words red and blue our color words? Wittgenstein is here precisely questioning the intelligibility of the claim that people might not be in general agreement about color judgments. Faced with someone who insists that people might not have been in general agreement about color judgments, Wittgenstein would have responded, not in general agreement about what? For judgments even to count as being about color, such general agreement in judgments must be in place. Hence, the supposition that a people might not be in general agreement in their color judgments is almost immediately self-undermining. Wittgenstein thinks that this kind of self-undermining can and usually does appear in more subtle guises. My aim, he writes famously, is to teach you to pass from a piece of disguised nonsense to something that is patent nonsense. Consider again the following observations of Wittgenstein collected by Stroud. I think this was 2 in your handout. So Stroud says, he's collecting this from Wittgenstein. There are various facts which make it possible for calculating to occur at all. For example, our memories are generally good enough for us not to take numbers twice and count up to 12 and not to leave any out. In correlating two groups of 5 strokes, we practically always can do so without remainder. Somebody who has learned to calculate never goes on getting different results and a given multiplication from what's in the arithmetic books, and so on. As Strouds understands them, these are all anthropological discoveries about human activities. Thus, Stroud takes it to be possible that, when correlating very small groups of like-numbered objects, we might often fail. Possible that someone who has learned to calculate might often diverge from the results in arithmetic books, and so on. So he must assume that we have an independent understanding of what it is to calculate, such that we can state which conditions are required for such an activity, where these requirements are contingent, in that there are intelligible descriptions of circumstances in which they would fail to hold. But the point of Wittgenstein's remarks is not to record empirical discoveries about the conditions that must obtain for humans to engage in the activity of calculating. His remarks cannot be treated as substantive claims which it would be intelligible to reject. If someone were to claim that he had discovered on the basis of empirical investigation that one of these facts did not obtain, that, for instance, when calculating, someone keeps getting different results from those in basic arithmetic books, Wittgenstein would respond, someone keeps diverging from different results in arithmetic books when doing what? If someone kept so diverging, if that would even be the right word, would we not lose our grip on what we were saying when we describe him as engaged in the activity of calculation? Consistently diverging from the results in basic arithmetic books, to paraphrase Wittgenstein, is just not what we call calculating. When someone talks about the knife without a handle, the blade of which has been lost, do we really understand him? In sum, Wittgenstein urges us not to take a statement like, people are in general agreement about color judgments, to be a contingent claim that is to be assimilated to descriptions of the natural world's contingent features, and thus a claim that it would be intelligible to deny. On what we might call the grammatical reading of this statement, which we favor, it rather illustrates how color words are used. On this reading, the statement is more akin to the claim that in chess, pawns do not move backwards than it is to all living beings need oxygen. When we say this about chess, we are not pointing to a contingent condition whose holding is required for us to play chess. We do not mean to be asserting that, should we move pawns backwards, then we would not be playing chess. That would be to assimilate the claim to one such as, if there were no oxygen on Earth, then there would be no living beings on Earth, which is a substantive claim that it would be intelligible to deny. But if someone were to tell us that pawns might have moved backwards, the best response would not be, in that case we would not be playing chess, but rather, what might have moved backwards? Or pawns might have what backwards? And certainly, I don't know what you're saying. We would be evincing our sense that the person had not yet learned the rules of chess. That is, not yet learned what it means to call something a pawn or a move in chess. We claimed that Stroud rejects what he himself considers the natural response to Wittgenstein's imagined cases, namely, that's not what we would call calculating, for suspect reasons. At least we think Wittgenstein would have so argued. Instead, Stroud takes the imagined cases to be useful tools in uncovering conditions that hold contingently, for example, agreement with arithmetic books, and are also requirements for certain activities on our part, for example, calculating. But we have just seen that Wittgenstein would have considered all this to be a mistake as well, for it involves treating certain remarks of his as substantive anthropological discoveries, when in fact they are, as he insists, grammatical notes. boiler building. We believe that our interpretation sheds light on remarks of Wittgenstein that are otherwise very difficult to understand. Let's consider his remarks on boiler construction in the investigations. He writes, this is 11 on your syllabus. What does man think for? What use is it? Why does he make boilers according to calculations and not leave the thickness of their walls to chance? After all, it's only a fact of experience that boilers do not explode so often if made according to these calculations. But just as having once been burnt, he would do anything rather than put his hand into a fire, so he would do anything rather than not calculate for a boiler. But as we are not interested in causes, we shall say, human beings do in fact think. This, for instance, is how they proceed when they make a boiler. Now, can't a boiler be produced in this way explode? Oh yes. Wittgenstein is conversing here with someone who takes it to be intelligible to raise questions of why humans developed into creatures that think. This question might be encouraged by the fact that local versions of the question are routinely raised. We tell students that it pays to double-check their answers on their logic test, because doing so will decrease the chances of a careless error. We appreciate that our contractor makes measurements using a measuring tape rather than an eyeball estimate, because we know that doing so will result in cabinets being placed in their correct location. And of course, the same goes for boiler construction. As Wittgenstein says later, quote, "There are fewer boiler explosions than formerly, now that we no longer go by feeling in deciding the thickness of the walls, but make such and such calculations instead. Or since each calculation done by one engineer got checked by a second one." Unquote. We might say in each of these local cases that, as Wittgenstein puts it, thinking has been found to pay. These specific observations might lead someone who is speculatively inclined to hypothesize about why thinking in general came to be engaged in by humans. One apparently attractive explanation is that mankind's development of this capacity turned on a certain contingent condition, namely the fact that the general capacity to think pays. That is, it turns out that many goals that humans have, for instance to build boilers, have a greater chance of being realized should we deploy our capacity to think whilst prosecuting them. Had the world been arranged differently, we might be animals who build boilers without thinking, say by leaving, quote, the thickness of their walls to chance, unquote. So, just as Stroud finds it is a contingent fact about us that we calculate in the precise way that we do, for we might not have had the sensibilities upon which turns our capacity to calculate as we do, this interlocutor suggests that it's a contingent fact about humans that they think. The world might not have been such that our projects are furthered by deliberation. It's part of the natural history of humankind, on this view, that it developed the capacity to think. Someone inclined to evolutionary accounts might speculate that the capacity to think is a heritable trait selected because it enhances the fitness of humans, etc. But Wittgenstein's reaction is in keeping with how we have argued he would respond to Stroud. Recall Wittgenstein's skeptical querying of what we might mean by calculating in the circumstance in which we kept diverging from the arithmetic books. What would it be for someone to calculate who kept so diverging? If these conjectures about thinking are genuinely empirical ones, then it should make sense to explore counterfactual scenarios. Say those in which there was no empirical connection between the deployment of thought and the successful prosecution of our projects. But what would it be, Wittgenstein suggests we ask ourselves, to build a boiler by flipping a coin? Should we stumble across people chucking bits of metal into a pit who responded when asked what they're doing, "We're building a boiler," would we know what to make of their answer? Would we conclude that they were building a boiler by relying on chance to assemble the parts just so? No, for that is simply not to build a boiler. To be sure, a boiler might just result from such a process, but still, that does not count as building a boiler. The interlocutor's assumptions in play here are that we have an independent conception of what it is to have the capacity for thought, and of what it is to be a human with distinctively human projects, like boiler building, such that we can speculate that that capacity developed because its exercise furthered those projects. But these are precisely the assumptions that Wittgenstein rejects. But surely Wittgenstein does not want to deny that it's a fact that humans have the capacity to think. Indeed, we just quoted him as saying, human beings do in fact think. Is this not to be understood as an empirical remark along the lines of plants engage in photosynthesis? Wittgenstein goes on to say that, quote, this, namely by calculating, for instance, is how they proceed when they make a boiler, unquote. Is this not to be understood as a further substantive remark along the lines of this, namely by photosynthesis, is how plants proceed when they nourish themselves? Indeed, we began this essay with Wittgenstein's observation that, quote, what we are supplying are really remarks on the natural history of man. It should be clear by now that we think that Wittgenstein's remarks on the natural history of man, for instance, that humans think, are not intended to be substantive claims about which we might conduct an inquiry. Such an interpretation will only lead us into confusion. Rather, they are grammatical notes, reminders of what everyone already knows, namely, that we wouldn't call human any animal that could not think, and that we wouldn't call boiler building any activity that proceeded without consideration of the thickness of the boiler's walls. That humans calculate is not a natural fact, at least not in the sense that would motivate an inquiry into those sensibilities that are responsible for our calculating, and whose failure to hold would have left humans without the capacity to calculate. That humans think is not a natural fact, at least not in the sense that would motivate an inquiry into those conditions that led humans to develop this capacity, and whose failure to hold would have left humans without this ability. There may be a sufficiently scrubbed use of human and calculate and think that would give substance to such claims and underwrite such inquiries, but it would be far removed from our ordinary uses, from the concept that we all gradually acquire of a being kindred to us. Very last brief section. I want to move away and expand these remarks. We have been discussing what might be called physical or metaphysical explorations of the human, and have suggested that Wittgenstein finds them confused, by contrast with the project of exploring the grammar of certain terms, like human. But there are moral explorations of the notion as well, which can be equally distorting. We take this to be the upshot of Cora Diamond's criticism of certain discussions of how to treat animals. Her target is the general idea that if humans are not the kind of thing it is acceptable to eat, then that must be in virtue of their having some relevant property, say the possession of interests, or the capacity to feel pain, or whatever. This idea is then put to the defense of vegetarianism, for instance, by insisting that some animals do not dramatically differ from humans with respect to those particular properties. Here we have a thought, or an inclination, that should by now feel familiar. we are being told that there is something about humans which is responsible for there not being creatures that we eat. Were humans not to possess the relevant property, then they, like oranges, would be unproblematically consumable. But we understand Diamond to want to respond in the fashion we have described so often above. But what might be consumable? She argues that, this last quotation on the head, it is not respect for our interests which is involved in our not eating each other. These are all things that go to determine what sort of concept human being is. Similarly, with our having duties to human beings. This is not a consequence of what human beings are. It is not justified by what human beings are. It is itself one of the things which go to build our notion of human being. If not eating one another is internal to the concept of human being, as Diamond claims, then to say that we do not eat each other, or that we have duties to human beings, is not to make a substantive claim that calls for a justification in terms of facts about human beings' interests or capacities. A justification that implies the intelligibility of the claim that if human beings failed to have these interests or capacities, it would be fine to eat them. It is rather to record a grammatical note about the concept human being. And if the difference between human beings and animals that interests moral philosophers is a grammatical one, then, quoting Diamond, it is not to be discovered by studies of Washoe or the activities of dolphins, unquote. The difference, as Diamond nicely puts it, is, quote, more an object of contemplation than observation. Similarly, if calculating is internal to the concept of human being, then that humans calculate is not a substantive fact to be treated as an object of empirical or metaphysical investigation, but a grammatical fact to be treated as an object of contemplation. It is an irony that Wittgenstein's remarks have stimulated such investigations, when their point, we have urged, was precisely to still them. Thank you.